I'm not going to look at it. I'm going to look anywhere but actually.
Okay. Basically, if you want, we can start because we have 10 more minutes, but the sooner we start, the sooner we finish.
You don't think the people are going to come?
I don't know. It's basically it's a democratic choice. So let's start it now or let's wait.
Let's start.
I don't care. If someone's likely to come, then we should wait. But if
Let's go.
If you want, we can wait 5 minutes.
he wants to get going.
Okay, he wants to get. Okay, let's start. Let's start.
No, I just.
So Andras, I also have to use just a moment. So thanks for everybody for coming. Thanks to everybody for coming. And as you all know from today's, those who have been sitting here since the morning and those who have been traveling since early morning, this is a conference in the memory of Mark Pittaway, who was an English labor historian, and his main work is the United States lies there. And basically, it is meant to be a junior conference. The main idea is to somehow show that his work and his ideas are carried further. I would like to thank Ursula, Mindler, Nigel, Swain, and Andras for coming. And the first question will be extremely easy. If you could tell us how did you get in touch with Mark and some personal memories, why do you think why are you sitting here in fact to remember? I don't know if normally it's the lady who wants to start, but since Nigel knows Mark from as a young teenager, I think Nigel should.
Okay, well, I happen to know that I first met him on Wednesday, the 26th of August, 1992. I looked in my files and found that that's when I met him. He contacted me the previous June at the suggestion of old Bill Lomax, who's completely disappeared from the scene, but wrote that important book about Hungary 1956. And Mark was asking about whether he could do a PhD in Liverpool. He came to see me later on in that year. We talked about it. We had two interests in common. One was Hungary, the other was labour under existing socialism or whatever. And that's how it started. I said, yes, I'll take him on as a research student. And he came. We got him to Hungary as quickly as we could. I gave him some contacts, but he made his own contacts incredibly quickly. And he was the easiest postgraduate student I've ever had. You just let him go. And he did it. So, but that's when I first met him. Yeah. Of course, we were friends ever since that first meeting.
Well, that's because you had the first, one of the first Hungarian contacts.
Yeah, I met with him around this time, I think, when he was first time in 92 or something like this. And we met, we did immediately friendship. We had long talk, drinking beer, we were younger. And we had great discussions, and until his unfortunate death, we maintained a very good friendship.
I met him in 2009, and it's because he contacted me in Graz because he was interested. He was doing a project on Austrian-Hungarian identity and the question of borders, identities, and stuff. So I'm not a labor historian, but he was interested in talking about the development of National Socialism in context of minorities and ethnic cleansing in the border region. That's where I that's basically what we discussed the whole time with Ursula, borders and identities.
The next question would be a question which I'm supposed to do, but I put this burden on you to introduce Mark's work. My only excuse is that I have written a review of his book, so and you can see it on there are all the notes there. So I know this book very thoroughly. But I would, since Nigel has been accompanying this work from the very beginning, if you could introduce his labor history to us, and then Andras should continue with the labor history, of which he has a different readings than Mark, but still I hope that. And then lastly, the Borderland project, which was his last project. He planned to write the second book on this topic about the materials that he collected. He collected lots of materials, but he couldn't finish the book. He didn't leave enough notes in order for us to read some books. So this was his one and only book, which is there. But the second book had been the problem. So,
well, if you don't mind, I'll read some. It's a bit naughty, but I wrote an epilogue to this collection, in which I sort of analysed the progression of Mark's ideas from his dissertation through to the book and then on to the Borderlands project. So I talk a little bit about, first of all, the dissertation, which I don't think anyone has read except me. A few people. And then the book. I mean, the dissertation, I think, was pathbreaking because it demolished the idea that theorists of totalitarian society put forward that the population under totalitarian regimes are atomized and impotent. He insists that Stalinism is not just a political process, it's a social one with unintended consequences and, in fact, surprisingly vulnerable. But, although he rejects atomization, he doesn't romanticize the working class either. He talks about particularized working class and he identifies separate roots within the working class. And I think the big strength of the book and the thesis is that he focuses on three very different communities of working class people and analyzes their reactions to the arrival of socialism. The thesis was very much on the socialist labour. It starts off in about 1948, but when he turned it into the book, he brings it forward to 1944 and looks at the imposition of the regimes, and his focus has been made a little bit more sophisticated. It moves from just understanding that there's sort of power there in the working class to this notion of legitimization, and that frames, I think, that frames his work sort of right up into the broader project, I think. So I've got a phrase here. So in the light of this new engagement with legitimacy, in Mark's conception, the socialist government not only failed to create its new communist working class, which was more or less what he says in the dissertation, in so failing, it also was unsuccessful in establishing the legitimacy of the regime in the eyes of the workers. So, there's, as I say, it's a slightly bigger project about legitimacy, and it leads right up to 1956 and the clear loss of legitimacy of the regime. I think that's all.
But here I may interrupt you because many of you, some of his critics, certainly are arguing that the regime never had any legitimacy, so they were nothing to lose. So if you could, because I forgot to mention that Nigel wrote a similarly fascinating book about the rise and fall of Italy and socialism. So how do you see the legitimacy of socialism?
Well,
in the middle of your work?
He's very careful to say that legitimacy doesn't mean that it is democratic or good. It just means a regime is able to establish legitimacy. People are willing to support it. Legitimacy is historically contingent, fragile, vulnerable, and then there are moments when it suddenly just disappears, like 56 or 89. In the book, he doesn't actually take sides on whether there was anything particularly good or bad about. Well, no, I suppose it's difficult to say that the same regime is good, but it's a very sort of analytical work. But that's a slight ambiguity in the term legitimacy is the source of some problems, because certain people felt he was claiming it was legitimate in the sense of good, and criticised his work for that, whereas I think what he's arguing is that the regime generated sufficient legitimacy in terms of people willing to support it for it to continue, because after all it did continue for 40 odd years.
Yeah. I think as Mark as a historian, it was very important that he came from Yorkshire, a mining idea. And I think he had, as a child, a very intimate knowledge of local working class culture or workers' culture. And his real interest is, I think, is what workers thought about the system and how they somehow find a kind of compromise with the system. But in a circumstance when the ruling political party is imposed the political system, which is use the working class as its own legitimacy basis for grabbing the power and creating the perception, or trying to create the perception that this is a worker state, which Marx is using as a kind of, in quotation marks. And really this is, to a certain extent, what is Mark really describing is how the Communist Party tried to use the working class as a legitimacy base, and how it didn't work out. And I think his work has two very interesting facets, because in one hand it describes very well the 50s and how the Stalinist regime is completely alienated the traditional working class. I would like to say also, he sometimes uses the word also in quotation mark, indicating that this is a political concept. And rather we have a workers' society which is very fragmented, very divided, with very different segments in it, which is, to a certain extent, is based by skill and seniority, on the other hand, based by various, I would say, cultural groups, like the urban skilled workers, who rather had this kind of leftist orientations, the rural workers, who was rather Christian conservative and rather turning to the right, and these were the workers who joined to them. Social fascism typically in the 30s, the late 30s. So Mark is really describing how the Communist Party tried to use the radicalization of certain segments of the workers to legitimize its own power, and how the system's own logic has destroyed this legitimacy, which led to the workers' uprising across the region in the 50s, and then born a new kind of compromise in the late 50s, in the Hungarian case, after the crushing of the 56 revolutions, which was, to a certain extent, workers' revolution, as Bill Lomas wrote it up. And also in this book, is From the Vanguard to the Margins, Workers in Hungary, is also describing how it was partly successful in the Kadarist consolidation attempt, based on various attempts to increase the standard of living working class and reaching a compromise with skilled workers elite. But on the other hand, it was how much was a kind of conditioned compromise, and how it couldn't be sustained in the long term. And I think to a certain extent his work is about that how didn't work the socialism. Not only for the majority of the population, but not even for those who were supposedly the base for the system. Yes.
About the border, because I don't want to ask you about the worker state, but if you could tell us something about it.
Well, the problem is that, as was said, it's not written that much. I can only talk about what we talked about when we met.
That's very good. That may be the documentation of his thoughts.
Yeah, so he came to say that he has this project on borders and identities in Austria-Hungary from 1938 to 1960, but he was only doing research on the northern border area, not on the southern part. That's why he contacted me, because I did the research in the southern part and wrote about that. And we were basically...
question, if you could introduce us your research, if you could tell us something about your own research, to make it easier for you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Well, then the research at that time was basically on the development and establishment of nationalism and national socialism in especially Styria and Bohemia, so the eastern part of Austria and Austria-Hungary. So I wrote about national socialist authorities and about their scopes of action and what they tried to set up in that area. And he had, he was talking about that he thought that the initiative for this wartime cleansing that was intended to be ethnic cleansing of Croats and especially of Magyars in Austria, that it came not from Bohemia but from local people over there. And this was something I was challenging, especially for the research I had done, because I said, well, what you can see within this scope of action those people have, that actually Berlin kind of gives this order to carry out this cleansing, and what the local National Socialists do is about that, well, if you're going to discard all the Croatian members of the National Socialist Party, there's almost nobody left in some parts of the Bohemia. So they have this big discussion going on, and this changes during the time before. But you cannot say that actually this initiative was just carried out by Berlin, or it was just carried out from the perpetrators. So we were discussing quite a lot about scopes of actions of people involved, about the involvement of the population, and how they supported the regime, how this would work. And we talked about if it makes sense to start in 1938, because what my criticism was on that is that you do not talk about the development before. 1938 is when Hitler kind of seizes power, the National Socialists seizes power in Austria, but you have a development before, and you cannot, I think that we should have started at an earlier point in time in order to see the continuity. So that's and of course, needless to say, we talked a lot about concepts. The concept of the invention of this concept of border is the word border and identities and stuff like that.
And I recall, I hadn't done research on borders, but I recall a discussion that how borders have been in the making. He studied the shopping area, how these borders have been created. Here, let me go back to the States. I'm sorry, I know much less of the nationals. I mean, I know because one of his papers, which actually was published in posthumously with Tanszék, which was about exactly what to say, that how much the local population was involved in the extermination of Jewish people. It wasn't just the order from the Berlin, but in fact the local.
Oh yeah, I have to say it's different, of course, for Jews and Gypsies, the persecution of Jews and Gypsies. He was just talking about poetic version and audio version, and that's a big difference because needless to say, you know, the extermination of gypsies and Jews, they were, you know, they had the same opinion on that, but they, you know, the ethnic groups had different positions from the point of the local information. So I was clearly forward. But maybe just one thing, why Mark Pittaway was really very important also for Austria at that time is because he dared to focus on this border issue, which was kind of a very tense relationship to the question of border. If you're allowed to question the concept of border or the origination and the creation of this border region. And what he did is that he said, well, we have to talk about that. We have to challenge those concepts. And I think that was very important because that raised again the interest in that region, and that it's legitimate to carry out research on that region. It's not only local history or people kind of are interested in it. It's a very big topic.
I'm also interested in here. I live in learning something I don't know that well. I don't know that well the Austrian memory of the Holocaust that well, but I think it questioned very much this common place, common memory, the present representation of the story that Austria was just a victim of Nazism and so on. So I think it did challenge that actually very sharply by focusing on the response of the local population and arguing that in the local population. Some initiatives came from the local population. Right. For the extermination of Jews. So, and in this particular paper, he did mention the collective memory of Austria. How this
has been for a very long time. Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's some change.
It is just a question of interest because so what is the change here? Because this is something.
Well, that the victim species is not valid anymore in the statement. Since that's there's new research carried out on that, and it's not the official position of Austria is not anymore that Austria was the first victim of this aggression. And for quite a long time it has been said, but it has changed.
Anyway, basically what we did trying to get at is that his next research now was about borders, but it was also about, I mean, he was interested also in the Holocaust, and he wanted to add something basically on behalf on the side of the local population. This was research about French because he also found some materials in the Chopin archives, in fact, related to the Holocaust, which he couldn't publish anymore. So I think one common point is always the local population. So basically, back to the state socialism, because you all right, the legitimacy was contingent and so on and so on. Just 1 week ago, I participated in a discussion that I tried to raise the issue, which I think Mark actually argued, that one half of Austria was also politically occupied by the Soviets. So, and he argued that in one of the papers, which I think is included, that in Austria, the Soviets also tried to raise popular support for the communists when it was completely failed end. So the basic argument is that there was left-wing radicalism on behalf of the local population in the eastern countries, which you couldn't find in the eastern countries. So basically, let me tackle again the question: how do you see the building of socialism?
Difficult question.
Let's forget about legitimacy, because we have argued that legitimacy is a very tricky issue because it involves some kind of democratic.
I've got something here, but I need to find it. So you start.
So I think, on one hand, he was clearly saying that after the First World War, this area went through a complete social disruption. which social disruption also made possible to certain segments of the population to raise their own concerns and gain voice, to have more voice in politics, which is we call democratization, and also to achieve better conditions. And this attempt was practically destroyed by the conservative oligarchic systems in the interwar years. Then came the horrible destruction of the Second World War, with its own horrible memories. And there were raised again this issue to certain segments of the population to gain democracy and to achieve better living conditions. Now, how much it was, we know exactly, or not exactly, that more or less. I mean, the Communist Party has like 16%, 20% of the votes, which is a large minority. And he made a very clear difference between the urban, traditional, skilled working class or workers, which supported the leftist political parties. But they also, in this book, he made a kind of geographical distinction, which workers groups supported the Social Democratic Party, which one the Communist Party, and which one the right parties. So typical kind of one factory, one city, workers' colonies supported the communists, like in Tatabánya or in Tóth. Skilled workers in Újpest rather supported the Social Democratic Party, and oil workers in Zala, which belonged to this conservative area, supported the smallholders' party. So the so-called working class, so the working class were divided. They had different support, they had different aims and dreams. And I think only a part of them is really supported the radical communist agenda. And also he writes about the different conception, because in the early 40s, the Communist Party tried not to be seen as radical, as the radical workers wanted to see, and this has created a conflict. And then after taking over the power in 48, 49, then suddenly the Communist Party became very radical, trying to create a new working class, which is went to a certain extent against those who supported the Communist Party originally. So to a certain extent, it is very similar, the story. You may not read, probably there's a very similar story written down in another, unfortunately very early, another Hungarian sociologist is called Vági Gábor, who wrote a wonderful history about poor peasants and how poor peasants supported the Communist Party in the 40s, hoping land, and then how in after 49 they were crushed by the regime. And to a certain extent, Mark also telling this story. And I think what is really coming out of this picture, that yes, the Communist Party came into power through the support of the Soviet Union and by building up a parallel security state, which is destroyed the right-wing or moderate left-wing parties. Also, it had some support, conditional support, some support, maybe 10, 15, 20% of population, which is substantial, but for any democratic mathematics is not enough. And I think this was his position.
Yeah, I think
no?
Yeah, and I agree absolutely. I'm sort of thinking about dates. You were saying that he should have gone back before 38, but actually, what I find interesting about that general history that he wrote, he starts in 1939, and because he starts in 1939,
or even after the First World War,
but the titles, and that allows him to discuss all those sorts of things that you've been talking about, and the parallel. I've got the quote here, but you used it. Yes, the Red Army assistance in the 70s, a parallel police state alongside the democratic one, whose origins lay in the wartime concerns, the hunt for fascist collaborators and so on. But then, once it's in place, it can be used for what it is used for, destroying ultimately the sort of more democratic wing of the sort of workers' movement. Now, the question about why it doesn't work in Austria, of course, is very interesting. And I don't think he really analyses that in much depth, but he does, in one of the articles, he talks about different policing methods, and the Hungarians have got this sort of, in theory, total control, but they're using all their control to chasing enemies, whereas the Austrians establish law and order and start getting a functioning economy. But that only just begs the question, why does the Soviet occupation allow them to do that in the Austrian part and not in Hungary? I guess it's probably because it's less controllable. I mean, Austria was always more ambiguous. I mean, even in the GDR, what becomes the GDR, the Soviet Union didn't behave quite the same way. But you can tell us all about why Austria is different.
No, it's just we were actually not discussing the question of the Communist Party. We were really just discussing the National Socialists. And because in Austria from 1933, 1934 to 1938, you have the Austrian fascist system. So you have a kind of fascist system at that time, which means that of course it plays a very important role also for the development of the political parties. And why in 1945 the situation is a little bit different from other countries around. So that's why I can understand your point that 1940 is earlier than after World War II.
I sort of agree with you.
It was kind of, I think it was a little bit problematic also with focusing only on the northeastern part of Austria, which is just not, I think it's a good local study, but it does not really explain or cover the development, the entire development in the eastern part. And also in its relationship to Hungary and what's going on in the border region in the southern part and northern part sometimes is quite different because it's also very much dependent on infrastructural issues, streets, railways, and all those other things.
But I think it's still a very exciting question that why, and it goes against the before question, why in Eastern Europe there are successful attempts of building communist systems, whereas in Finland or in the eastern part of Austria, there are attempts
because there are, I mean, for me it's very clear. Because of the Russian or the Soviet Union.
Percentage agreement.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you think on, for example, Czechoslovakia or Czechia. I mean, Czechoslovakia was a much more developed and much more democratic country in the interwar years than Austria was. I mean, Austria had civil wars and all kinds of difficulties in the 20s and the 30s. Czechoslovakia was a completely normal, highly developed, very industrialized, democratic country.
More or less.
More or less. It has its own problem, but,
but
it's very difficult to assess from our current standpoint what was happening 16 years ago by international standard. Czechoslovakia was absolutely, and it was a highly developed country and highly industrialized. And then because of this percentage agreement and what kind of leverage had the Russian Soviet Union, the KGB or whatever organization that had before over these things, I think it's very clear. Even his work is coming out with this.
I would say actually like the opposite, that his work is trying to show or to prove that at least in Hungary there is something special in the social development, like a bit of backwardness and so on and so on. And there is a certain attraction of left-wing radicalism. I see that is the point he's trying to make. That is one of the points.
Yeah, but he is also saying that how small percentages really affected this left-wing radicalism, which is clearly saying that most of the rural population were Catholic conservative. Even most of the rural workers were Catholic conservative.
Because they were the same people.
Absolutely, more or less. And only a small segment of the so-called working class is really attached to the left. And some of them, more than half of them, to the Socialist Party, which is by nature should be a much more democratic party. And we know from the, I don't know, have you read the Tüzes Kemence and Tomi Kemeni by György Marosán, how he describes how the so-called right-wing wing of the Social Party was destroyed by the secretary. So I think it is it's very clear what has happened.
He certainly has, and he's writing about Tatabánya, the workers, which are the most radical, militant, which constitute the most militant working class group out of the three which he examines. He at some places he's writing that, or he's citing archival documents that the local organization, communist organization, press for more nationalization. So there is grassroots radicalism.
But there are two things you can say. That's exactly the same in South Wales. South Wales miners are all communists. Scottish miners are all communists. And there's a very strong tradition of communism amongst miners. But you've got the same thing in agriculture. It's some of the peasant party that's pushing for a more radical land reform than the one that's actually introduced. Because, as you said earlier, the communists are wanting to have this rather moderate image and introduce a good bourgeois land reform, because of course they screwed up on the land reform in 1919. The great communist Hungarian era. To try and go straight to collective farms.
But we could invite those who are sitting here also if they have opinion, because we don't want to monopolize the discussion. So,
I wanted to ask one more question. So how do you see Mark's contribution towards labor history, towards global labor history, if I may say that, and how do you see his contribution towards the global history? I mean, he couldn't do much, but he still published some books.
Oh, I think.
How do you see his contribution?
No, I mean,
global labor history. And then there will be some more questions.
I would actually take it a little bit beyond just labour history, because for me, what's really important about what Mark does is the way that he links political and social. And so, I mean, labour is a particular social issue that is politicised, and that's what he's looking at. And then sort of the ethnicity of the border regions is another social issue that he's looking at as well. But it's not political history. It's not there's a vague interest group there that politicians have to deal with. He's looking at politicians have to deal with the fact that there's a real actual entity there called the working class, except it's not the working class. It's 5, 6, 7 different types of working class, all of whom are responding. I go back to this against the idea of these sort of impotent masses. People are not impotent. People are people with social organisations, and politicians have to relate to them. And I think that's what he really does very, very well. But in terms of the labour history, I mean, I think in terms of labour history of Eastern Europe, just the simple thing of having those 3 different types of workers, there's a whole agenda there for other people to say, actually, there's 5 or 6, or no, actually, he's got this wrong. But he's set a tremendous, I mean, I think, it's path-breaking because it goes beyond all this totalitarian nonsense, although not many people believe that anymore, thank goodness. And it's agenda setting, it sets this really strong agenda. And then, as I say, that this interlinking always, it's not social history of, there are these funny groups who do things. He's always interested in the political context of social forces, and that's, I suppose, that's what I find interesting. But that's why I think he's a major historian. And the other thing, of course, is just his methodology, just the sheer amount of stuff that he looks at. So his work is not, I mean, it does come from up there, but the point is he's always engaging up there with all this stuff that he meets on the ground in these archives all over the country, and then not just over the country, over the border in Austria and so on. That's what I find so impressive, and why I would recommend it to my students as a model of this is how you do social history. Okay, maybe.
It's very similar. Okay.
No,
so for me, so for me, I mean, I just looked at subtitle of the book. They said Industrial Labor and the Making of Socialist Hungary. Very intimidating title. No, you would think that it's coming about politics and big things. And really, I think he's belonging to the tradition of individual methodology, of the British individual. And he's really interested in the worker who is in portrait here. Every story of him is about begging. What did Kovács Pál say in Budapest? What did XY did in the pit? And he's really he's really trying to get, okay, here's the big stuff. Secret police, all kinds of horrible things is happening, and there is the people who try to survive. And they have their own society, their own hierarchy, they have their own life. There's coming something from above which is trying to destroy them or change them, which is almost amount to destroy. And how these people try to find out their own way. How this workers what he's interested in the worker, in the human being. And how these human beings in this challenging time try to find some kind of new compromise which is allowing them to somehow continue the life which they accustomed to, which they live through, and they know that what is the good workers, is the skilled workers, what is the hierarchy, how they try to re-establish the old security and the old way of living and respect. And I think this is the real interesting in Mark's work, is always coming out the person, the individual, the small community, the group, the team, the friends, the relationship to the foreman, who is one of them, just became a foreman, and how the foreman is making the compromise possible with the management who is made deployed by the party. So this is what he's really interested in. It is, to a certain extent, putting sociology into history. And really he's interested in the worker's life, which is maybe coming from this childhood experience which I make in the story.
Yes,
and I think this is why I found very interesting to read the book of Mark. Because I'm grasping the person's worry. And there is about the human. And this is about Mark, because Mark was, we all know, Mark was a wonderful person. He liked to chat, he was very concerned about the other person. He was very interested in different person. And I think this is what is really driving his work. And trying to show that despite the very unfortunate circumstances, these people somehow trying to make a compromise, and they achieved to a certain extent.
I actually, I think he was very successful in this book, but also in this program, one of the two works in particular, which he wrote about the program project, linking the macro and the micro.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it is not all stories about workers and so on, but he has a very strong, very political. He's combining political history and political and social history.
And also not only giving people a voice, but also talking about responsibilities. That that it's not only like encouraging the small persons, but also about talking about what does that mean. That these people, I mean, they all did something and they contributed to something, and that means that they, you cannot always blame systems or kind of people in Germany, as we were talking about the border region, right? But it's those people, on the one hand, by I think this, I mean, he had so manifold sources, and so many, also focusing on county archives, for example, where people are making fun of what is he going to find, you have to go to Vienna, to Budapest, you don't go to the very small archives. That's what he did. And he went everywhere, and also paying so much attention to details. And he said, that's important, you need to know the details, and then you can talk about the bigger picture. And I think that's really And I don't know what took the time to do all those things, to be in all those archives, seeing, translating all those sources, thinking, booking, being so highly influential on so many students and colleagues. And so.
Before we invite the audience to join, I have one more question, which I think it was very important part of Mark's life, and that is political agenda. Because as you said, okay, he was committed to certain causes, and he had very strong political views, and he was also active politically. So, how do you see his political views? That's perhaps a very personal question, but rather more general question which interests me: that how do you see the relationship between the scholar and
general.
In general, yes.
That's a
huge issue.
That's a huge issue.
When they are talking about Mark's political views, it's very personal issues really. So,
well, Mark's
free to skip that issue.
Mark is clearly on the left. I mean, but he's very it would be difficult to identify him with a particular grouping on the left. I think you're quite right. His image of him, his sort of self-identification is with sort of the working class in the north of England. He certainly doesn't adhere to any of the sort of standard extreme left philosophies, Trotsky's vision of it, even a Marxist vision, and certainly towards the end of his life he was more attracted by the Greens, I believe. But it's the sort of concern for humanity that is a theme of the left, which I think I would associate with him, because concern for humanity means that he's interested in the poor and sort of the oppressed, and that guides the sort of the history he writes. And so you want me to I think generally actually I'm quite open about my academic work. I see it as having a political sort of side to it, because I too like to think that I'm the side of the oppressed, maybe not quite in the same way that Mark was. But it guides what you're going to do, isn't it? If you're interested in the oppressed, the workers, the struggling miners in Yorkshire, then you start thinking, I'm going to be interested in working class gentlemen. Clearly, when he first came to me, it was a very sort of generic. I'm interested in the working class and the socialism because I've got a sense that clearly it's not worked. Something that calls itself a worker state is not working. Indeed, that's the reason I got interested in Hungary 20 odd years before him, was that it's supposed to be a worker state. It's clearly not. How can we understand what's happening? And I think that sort of drove him, as in a way it's driven me for my research. So I think you can't avoid it, really. So it's not even that you should or you shouldn't. It's very difficult not to let your critical views guide your research, unless you have a very compartmentalised life.
It's very interesting because I think what he's left is beyond what you said. His worldview is really shaped by what has happened in the 70s in England. The Thatcherite reforms and the minor strikes and all and it's very interesting if you look his last book of this. It has really two types of articles in it. The one is which is dealing with post-89 Hungary. And it's very clearly comes out that he is against this neoliberal agenda and he wants to have a different agenda for Hungary. But this is not history. He is rather a political commentator. He's putting forward his own opinion, but as a historian. And if I'm reading his book, which is about really what it was his topic as a historian, about the workers' lives in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, I couldn't tell that this is written by this person. absolute. I think he writes everything down which I would write down. And he's very honest about the system. He doesn't try to make nicer. He doesn't silence about oppression and so on. Yes, and in this sense, as a historian, he's tried to be as impartial as possible, and when it's coming out is this leftism, it is like the humanism, what you mentioned. Yeah. The interest in the worker's life as a topic. But he doesn't have a leftist agenda in his writing, and he doesn't try to put forward as far as I see. I read now both books, just preparing myself to this, and I honestly I don't feel that it has any agenda which tries to push. And I think this is this kind of Weberian impartiality which he tries to. And I think this is a wonderful research attitude that we have.
How do you think that?
Actually, now, before I invite you to answer the last question, so it's perhaps difficult, but in the more you try to touch this question, it's a very big topic that once we recognize that there is no working class, but working classes, or many working classes, once we recognize that this working class is not necessarily, that was the topic of the afternoon session, it's not necessarily left-wing voters, but they vote for the right-wing or for the far-right. So it's a question also put to me, what is left of the right-wing agenda? And even more importantly, that what are the new directions of right-wing labor history? big topic. Or how can we?
I think in England there's hardly any labour history done now. There's very, very, very little labour history. It's gone right out of fashion because the working class, as a political agent in the United Kingdom,
we have to be careful because global labour history is what there is global labour history. So how?
Well, well, I don't know a labour historian under about 60 in England, but I might have missed it. If there is a new generation out there, I'd love to meet them because I feel they've certainly disappeared from sort of the university context in which I operate, which is a shame. No, that's not quite true actually. There are some arguments, and it sort of depends exactly what you mean by labour history.
It's a good question. What do you mean by labour history?
Well, I mean, it used to mean a lot of people who were very close to the Communist Party writing about things that people who were close to the Communist Party thought were important. And so I guess because the Communist Party doesn't exist and traditional working class doesn't exist in the UK anymore, those sorts of things have disappeared. But I don't have clear ideas, as you can see, so there's not much point in me rambling on. You say something.
No,
I think Mark is the best. The best for
the young generation. So maybe, what do you think about labour history today? Since this was the topic, in the morning we were very optimistic that there is labour history, and we hear.
Yeah, because I wasn't here this morning, so
I
wasn't here this morning, so.
Maybe once, because but this is mine. So I think what is wonderful in Mark's work that he is belonging to that generation which is not anymore viewing work as through the Marxist lens. And I think many, all their labor history is viewing the workers through the Marxist lens. And through that lens which is somehow, as he writes about, there is an imaginary working class.
There's an imagined working class that's going to rise up and take over and fulfill the Marxist dream. And all we know about that is it doesn't.
And I think what is wonderful in his work, that he's looking actual workers.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe we should go back to a certain extent. It was discussed before in the why French workers are supporting Geffen and not voting for the left. Maybe, but I'm not familiar with the labor history, so but maybe we should go back and to really see who they were, who they are, what they are really interested in, without having this kind of ideologically distorted lens on us. Maybe it is, but I'm not familiar. So this is my own perspective in a country which was for decades everything one sees through this lens.
Yeah, that's very much. I mean, even in the 70s, you have sociological research which is not necessarily Marxist. So it was not on the official agenda, but still you had research going on. I don't know more of the sociology.
Well, yeah. The thing is, there's a lot of sociologists writing in the 1970s, but an awful lot of the historians in the 1970s were still working in a Marxist agenda and having some sort of this notion of, there is somehow this congruity between workers and revolution and workers and the Communist Party. And actually, the people who support the Communist Party are never ever the vanguard of the working class. My wife's PhD thesis is all about why they're either fascist or they're sort of violent communists, but they don't behave the way Marx thinks they should. And as I heard earlier, as I came in very late, that there's plenty of examples of working class voting for fascist parties in Germany and in Hungary and Romania.
Or right-wing conservative party.
But that sort of assumption that there's some sort of congruity was present, I think, amongst historians when sociologists were already reticent a bit in the 1970s.
Well, I mean, I would argue that in certainly the 1970s, you have this research which challenges this very much. For instance.
No, but those are sociologists. But I think if you think of Western, I can only speak of Western historians writing in the 1970s, they still have a sort of romantic agenda, whereas sociologists do not. But there might be something to do with the way labour history is positioned in England, which is still, sort of labour history is very male, very trade union, very Communist Party. That's sort of just the way it was.
Well, I think let's invite you to some more questions or comments.
What I would be interested in, but that's a question to those who have known him much better than I did. Probably we talked about this already, but probably not. How did he conceive of the fact, or did he somehow reflect on the fact that he did labor history on state socialist Eastern Europe, state socialist Eastern Europe as a scene, in a period that basically nobody else did it? How did he reflect on this? Did he have an idea about what that might mean for labor history in and on Eastern Europe more generally, or was he just obsessed with he wants to do that and didn't care about his broader context? But that's really for those who know his work better or know him better.
Yeah, and I can only say what. I mean, he never talked about that with me. I think, but perhaps because we both just shared the obsession, we just talked about our obsession. He never, to my mind, never tried to sort of situate what he was doing.
No,
I don't. Well, we never talked about it. Of course, there was always, I was supervisor, he was pupil, so I think we always had open discussions, but who knows, he might have always been, I don't see it in Mark's nature to be deferential. No, we didn't. We shared an obsession, and we thought it was important. And I think we thought it was important for sort of similar reasons, although I don't come from the north of England, and my family was sort of, my parents were not working class, although my grandparents were. We sort of shared this background, I think.
Yeah, but that's the other side.
But that's
why
exactly,
you get there.
exactly
Right?
how we get there. Well, I got there quite clearly, not for anything to do with history, because I wanted to understand what was wrong, how these societies had gone wrong. I was clearly always political, and I sort of, in the end, you have to have a career, and you manage to sort of go into sociology first, and then history. But my interest was always understanding why it wasn't working, and therefore, but why a society that calls itself a society that's supposed to be serving labour, because that's what Marxists thought it was doing, was clearly not. But as you say, if he did attempt to situate it, then he never talked to me about it.
I think there was a generation of younger scholars around him. He is also making references. I'm not familiar with this literature, but Kenny Padre, Fritz Shane-Patrick, and the American scholar and others who did kind of similar research on workers' life in Poland, in Russia during the Stalinist regime, who tried to show. Some of them is maybe driven by different interests, but also trying to see what workers' life was. And there was a research stream.
But he clearly was first.
In Hungary, certainly. But in Hungary also, there is a tradition of, around this time when he worked here, where was published the book of Varga László, Az elhagyott tömeg, which is asking very similar questions.
I think that you mentioned that there was this romantic glasses through which Marxists saw the working class. And after 1989, I think these romantic glasses is exchanged for completely anti-romantic glass. So everything is denied, or there is outright legacy of this totalitarianism, which shapes very much post-1989 literature. And I think that Mark, in that sense, was revolutionary, not by going back to the old left and saying that yes, it was because it was Stalinist, so that's of course stupid, but still keep something of the idea that the working, we can speak of different working class. It makes sense to speak of class in terms of workers, because I know, what I know of the German literature of the post 1989 is that everything which had anything to do with class was completely abolished. So you have gender, you have different regions, but to talk of class consciousness, that was certainly the case at the time when Mark was writing his book. So in that sense, I think that he was definitely fighting against totalitarianism. We can argue that it's dead now. It's maybe after the global crisis. It's not longer dead, Let me tell you just one story. So, for instance, the worker state was supposed to be, I mean, originally gave it to the Oxford University Press. And one reviewer was very positive and was absolutely recommended, frustrating, blah, blah. And the other one openly said, I mean, like he was, that doesn't matter, but guy, that he doesn't, I mean, the reviewer openly said that he cannot find professional mistakes, but he hates the whole idea of all of the money. So it was really politically motivated. But since he was senior, also the University Press decided to accept this view, and this is how it went to Pittsburgh University Press. So I think first of all, totalitarianism is not dead, and second, I think that he had to fight against lots of obstacles, ideological obstacles.
But I think in a way, what Mark does is goes against a lot of certainly traditional British Labour history, because traditional Labour history in Britain does tend to see the working class as this undifferentiated, heroic thing, instead of looking in the nitty-gritty and seeing that there are many different working classes. So he, as I say, I think it might be to do with the way the term Labour history is used just in Great Britain, but it's associated, not so much history of labour, but a particular type of history about the labour movement, and usually written by people who are sympathetic to it. So maybe we're talking about slightly different things.
Well, I mean, in the post-1989 Hungarian arena, I think, okay, we can, in the morning we discussed a bit about the provinciality. I think that's a key word. It is becoming extremely provincial because theoretically it is influenced by really old-fashioned, because for totalitarianism is an old-fashioned paradigm, I think I can claim that. So the basic question is that why there was no dialogue between Mark and the Hungarian historian, many Hungarian historians, or certainly the younger generations, and I think one reason was this, that because the Eastern European scholarship, I mean, inviting you for a discussion, has become very provincial for many reasons. But it's different. It's a very strong statement, but it's a very strong statement. And in that sense, Mark was trying to make something to make a case study, to render a case study international interesting. Whereas the local historians tend to do something provincial. But listen to me, I would be very happy if you could tell me that it's not true.
No, to a certain extent, Mark, yes, maybe there wasn't discussion academic journals, but Mark had a very dense social life here. He had lots of friends. He spent a lot of time drinking beer. He wasn't from Yorkshire, so he was drinking beer, but also discussing issues. And he really helped a lot of Hungarian academics to go to international. Eszter was one of them. Zsuzsa. And they had a lot of other friends of him. So I think, I wouldn't say there was not an intense discussion with Mark, maybe not through articles for whatever reason, but there was a very intense discussion with Mark in after hours, so through socializing. And with Mark, he was a very encyclopedic knowledge, and there was this, you could really speak with him about, he was really interested in politics, society, and what is happening. Europe, US, world, Hungary, Austria, and so on. He had an excellent, and I remember, we almost never discussed about personal issues. We spent endless hours, and I'm sure not only with me, but with all other friends of him, and he was friends with everybody. And he was really a kind of very easygoing socializing style. So I think through these informal discussions, he really contributed a lot to the academic development in Hungary. And we had a lot of discussions through this. And there was really a lively discussion, maybe not memorized for the future through academic articles.
bit of a personal story, but I would still stick to this idea of the provincialism versus, and I would really like you for that. Nigel, you have been here in the before 1989. And maybe I'm completely wrong, but my theory or my assumption is that in the 70s, Eastern Europe was more interesting for the West than academic, also academically, not only regionally, but also academically as after.
I don't know. Well, yeah, Eastern Europe was, Hungary wasn't. Nobody cared about Hungary. Why be interested in Hungary? You know, the British establishment was interested in the Soviet Union because it had nuclear bombs. It was interested in Poland because it was big. And Hungary was, and in any case, most of the Eastern Europeanists only spoke Slav languages, so Hungary was ruled out for that reason. Then Hungary got a bit more interesting after 1989 because people started investing, so a different lot of people were interested in Hungary. But interested in Hungary as a country, there weren't many of us. I mean, there were 3 of us in my youth. Was it maybe four? There was me, there was Paul Hare, there was Hugo Badici, and there was Chris Ham. And maybe a couple of other people. And then there was some more, but now there are hardly any. Except I went to a conference in Glasgow last week with postgraduates working on Hungary. And, well, there was a whole day's program. So that is quite an increase for people suddenly. But they're not all, they're sort of everything to do with Hungary. It's not Hungarian working class, it's not Hungarian politics. It's mainly Hungarian politics. Also a bit about Hungarian culture.
Sorry, it's Bill Lomax. Bill Lomax wrote a famous book about 56. He told me that the story of this book was when he was 70 something, he came to Hungary as an international exchange program. And then the then director of the academic institute, which is hosted him, it was Kamen Kulcsák. And Kulcsák Kamen told him, Bill, you don't have to do any research here. Don't worry, just don't do research. Enjoy your life. Now Bill also liked to drink beer. He was also around north of England. It's a very dangerous area as far as beer concerned. So he went to pubs and he made a lot of friendship there. And happened that some of the friends who made at the pubs were 56 revolutionists. And this is how we began to interest in that topic. So whether Hungary was more open or more closed, no, I don't think so. It was more open than now. Because now it's impossible to have this.
I mean, obviously it's more open in many respects. I mean, I look back and I remember, I had to get a visa to come here. If you didn't stay in a hotel, you had to report that you were here within 2 days. Otherwise, the police were banging on your door. All this sort of nonsense that we put up with as quite normal. That's the weird thing. So it's obviously much more open in that sense. But I'm not convinced that there's much more interest in the West. Which is probably why Mark, I don't know how well Mark's book is selling, but I can't imagine it's a bestseller. But no one expected it to be.
And the last question which I'm inviting to how do you see, it is in general specific situation of Western scholar comes to this country and makes research there, and some of you here are doing this exactly. So how would you reflect on your own scholarly position? If I may ask this question, because obviously for Western area, the obvious choice is the Western topic. Because I think what Nigel mentioned, it's a common problem. If you write something of English, whatever, then you have much higher chance to be a bestseller than if you write something of either Austria or Hungary or whatever, Germany. So how would you reflect on your own work and position?
Well, when I came here, that was also in 1990 or something, I met with everybody who did anything about not labor history in my case, but urban history. And my experience back then was they were absolutely not interested in what I am doing. They were absolutely interested in telling me how I have to see things, what is the real knowledge about Budapest in 1890 or 1910, so that I had to go through, and that was it. I didn't have any more, so they know me, I know them, there is no real communication, and there never was. But that's what I can say on that level. So I was a real stranger. It was, nobody was hostile or anything. It was all fine, but I was and remained a real stranger.
Did you drink beer?
Oh, I drank beer, not this historian. That was better. Of course, I could talk much more about this, but I think that's the interesting part.
I still have, because we still have, I think, we wanted to finish in 6 more minutes, so we have time to. Also, I mean, it was just for fun, but I think it's a very specific situation, also as a, but also for Western country, for less developed country, and to learn language and all that. So it's an investment which actually very few people would make. And also, I don't want to use the term sacrifice, but sacrifice in the sense that you are you are making, you are choosing a topic which puts you in a disadvantaged position in your own country,
yes,
to put it bluntly, and you have to act as how we call this, as ambassador, transmitter of ideas. So you have to act as intermediate, mediator between cultures, and this can be a.
Well, I think that's different in Austria, because Austrian historians, I mean, they always have special agreement with Hungary. In the States archives, for example, there's always a Hungarian delegation that, has, I mean, basically old man or whatever, but still, I mean, there have always been some special agreements. So there was the so-called Mogastoffer Symposium that had tried to get people from Hungary to Austria, to Croatia, to Slovenia. We had exchange in the former monarchy states. So if you do Hungarian history in Austria, it's not labeled as something very strange, or it's not labeled as something which would not be important. But maybe it's they consider it to be part of the Austrian history, and that's why it's kind of legitimate. It's a little bit of a colonial thing. So that makes maybe the difference why people are not. And I mean, still, in the eastern part, many people speak Hungarian. It does not mean that you really have to put so much energy into learning the languages. It's less obstacles than if you're brought up in London and then you have to learn Hungarian. So I think maybe the situation is a little bit different there. But if you do Jewish history, I think it's a different. It depends on the topic, maybe too.
But I think people are always a little bit isolated. You've got your career, ultimately, whatever your research topic, your career is back home. And that's where you're having to make all of your your career-related contacts. So you're always a little bit sort of isolated when you're here, because it's a sort of slightly different world. I've got a lot of friends here who've got nothing to do with academia. Probably my closest friends are not academics at all. As far as academics are concerned, they're probably, there are 2 or 3 people just from whom I learnt an awful lot. So my relationship actually has always been one of sort of a pupil to them. They've taught me an awful lot. and then a whole load of people who you get on well with, you talk to, but you're not desperately close to, because again, the career, your future career is not linked to them in any way. So I think that might be why it's a little bit isolated.
But I try to get at this I think it is always can be very humiliating if you come from a different culture and you have a different eye on the same things. I think the right to us is tackle this issue about how Mark tried to situate himself.
Yes.
I think this is
because I gave up trying
Trying
to situate myself very quickly, right? When I back in the 1990s, because I just felt there's no interest in my topic. There is no interest in my approach. I didn't know very well what my approach was, but there was no interest in it, and I just did my own thing, right? I went to the archives every morning. When the archives closed, I went to the Soborelli library. I spent there another 3 hours. I knew I would be doing my dissertation. I had no idea what else I would do, but I was not part of the business here, and I didn't try to become one, because if you feel there was no hostility, but also no interest, and that was it. And in the very beginning, I thought it is about my topic, right? Because my topic was not labor history, but it was social and welfare politics, and that was as old-fashioned, and as associated with the old regime as workers' history. So they just felt, we have done that, and it's finished. And I tried to tell them, no, there is one article actually about poor relief in Budapest. One article, that's not, we do more. Yes, but then, and then they told me again that they know everything about that topic. Nobody said it's a good project. Do it. Look into these sources or that sources.
No,
But
do
zero.
you think it's a Hungarian phenomenon? Because I think of, for example, the people who wrote the first books, really good books about Jews in Austria, it's American historians who came to Austria and heard about Jews in Vienna. And I don't think that they were, invited to join the community at Vienna University. I mean, there might have been some people helping them, but I mean, they did quite a lot of work under very rough conditions. And I bet nobody was interested at that time in the topic, or and it was not even National Socialism. So I don't know if it's just a Hungarian phenomenon.
I'm not saying this. This is my only experience. I have no comparison.
Okay, in that sense, Mark was probably also isolated from the. Okay, he made many friendships here, but scholarly, I think he was he had the same experience. That's my feeling. Questions, because actually we wanted to finish 15 minutes earlier so that to make the reception, the room ready for the reception. So, and I apologize, we started 10 minutes earlier. But if you have any questions after this talk, please feel free to ask us. Thank you very much for everybody, and then we are rearranging the room for the reception. No, I